Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For this week's true crime narration, we shall be looking at the life of John DuPont, a member of the prominent DuPont family from the United States. John Eleuthere DuPont was born on the 22nd of November 1938. He was the great-great-grandson of Eleuthere Irenee DuPont, who founded the giant chemical company that bears the family name. Over 200 years later, in 2020, the DuPont family had an estimated net worth of around $16 billion, spread across some 4,000 family members. John was the youngest of 4 children born to William DuPont Jr. and Jean Lisetta Austin. He had 2 older sisters, Jean and Evelyn, and an older brother named Henry. Both of his parents' families had emigrated to the United States from Europe at the beginning of the 19th century and had gone on to become extremely successful. When William and Jean married in 1919, they were given over 600 acres of land in Newton Square, Pennsylvania, by Jean's father. 6 years later, William's father built a mansion for the couple, which became known as Lisetta Hall. The mansion was a replica of Montpelier, the 1760 Virginia estate built by James Madison Sr., the father of the 4th President of the United States. William's father had bought Montpelier in 1900, and William was raised there. Just 2 years after John was born, his parents, William and Jean, divorced after 21 years of marriage. Jean remained living at Lisetta Hall with the children, and when his older siblings moved out to go to boarding schools, John remained living on the vast estate with his mother. It was an isolated and lonely existence, and John would often find solace in nature and with the animals on the vast estate, which was used for, amongst other things, thoroughbred horses, Welsh ponies, breeding dogs, and a dairy herd. John was socially awkward and struggled to make friends. He had one friend growing up, Hugh Cherry, who was the son of his mother's chauffeur. John would later learn that his mother had paid the Cherry family so that Hugh would be John's friend, perhaps imprinting on John's young brain that anything was available for a price, albeit superficially. It is unclear the extent of John's father's involvement in his son's life following the divorce, but his father soon remarried and went on to have another son. John attended the private Haverford School in Pennsylvania, where he succeeded academically but not socially, and after enrolling and then withdrawing from the University of Pennsylvania, he went on to attend the University of Miami. In 1965, he graduated with a degree in marine biology. In that same year, his father died at the age of 68. John was a keen ornithologist, philatelist, and conchologist. In 1967, he had the largest private collection of seashells in the world, over 250,000. He completed a doctorate in natural science at the Villanova University, which is a private Catholic research university, and participated in multiple scientific expeditions to study and identify birds in the Philippines and the South Pacific. He has been credited with the discovery of around 24 species of birds. Using his collections and knowledge, he founded the Delaware Museum of Natural History, which opened in 1972. Despite these accomplishments in his chosen fields, John's true passion lay in competitive sports, and he began training for the pentathlon. In 1966, an Olympic-sized pool was constructed on the estate, with the surrounding walls decorated with mosaic portraits of John in each of the 5 pentathlon disciplines. He was considered a bright prospect for the 1968 US Olympic pentathlon team, but ultimately an injury prevented him from competing. During training, it is believed that he was thrown from his horse into a fence and sustained significant injury to his testicles. His testicles subsequently became infected and, as a result, were removed. Around this time, John created a three-sport event consisting of running, swimming and shooting. The idea of this was to identify those with the potential to be taught riding and fencing, which were sports not readily available to most people, in order to compete in the pentathlon. Arguably, this is what introduced the triathlon to the United States. In 1966, the first US Triathlon Championship was held at Eleuthere Farm, and whilst unable to compete at a high level himself, John was actively involved with dozens of athletes who would now use the extensive training facilities which he had built. Publicly, John was viewed as an athlete, curator, benefactor and author, but privately, to those who knew him well, he was an eccentric character who was desperate to gain respect and attention. In the 1980s, John turned his attention to sponsoring the US Olympic wrestling team and went on to develop Eleuthere Hall Farm as a wrestling facility for amateur wrestlers. The group became known as Team Foxcatcher as a tribute to his late father, who had used the name Foxcatcher for his racing stable in the 1920s. In 1982, John met a lady by the name of Gail Wenck following a minor car accident. John had injured his hand during the accident, and Gail was an occupational therapist who helped him. The pair married on September the 3rd the following year, but the marriage was short-lived. They lived together for less than 6 months, and John had filed for divorce before their first wedding anniversary. During the 1980s, two brothers by the names of Mark and Dave Schultz became the only siblings to win both the World and Olympic Wrestling Championships. Despite their many accolades, Mark and Dave struggled to make ends meet as USA Wrestling did not pay its athletes. John convinced Mark, the younger of the two brothers by 17 months, to join his wrestling program, enticing him in with a generous salary and a home in the grounds of the estate. John and Gail's divorce did not become final until 1987. Gail sued John for $5 million, claiming that, amongst other things, he had tried to push her from a moving car and that he had accused her of being a Russian spy and had threatened her with a gun. The amount that Gail received following the divorce has not been disclosed. In 1987, Mark won the World Championship, and shortly afterwards he persuaded his brother Dave to join him working at Foxcatcher. By the time Dave joined, John had built a state-of-the-art facility where a group of world-class wrestlers trained, and Dave became the coach of the Foxcatcher team. Dave was a popular man who coached and helped the other wrestlers with kindness and expertise, and seemed to effortlessly attract the kind of respect and admiration that John so desperately craved. Whilst John's behaviour was often chaotic, Dave seemed to be a calming influence on him. The following year, in August 1988, John's mother, Jean, died at the age of 90. John turned up late for her funeral, wearing a tracksuit and carrying a drink. Soon after, John renamed Eleuthere Farm to Foxcatcher Farm, and he moved from one of the smaller estate houses where he had been living as an adult into Eleuthere Hall. It would seem that his mother's death was the trigger for his eccentricities to spiral into something much darker. A wrestling program, which he had set up 2 years earlier at the Villanova University, was closed after a lawsuit which claimed that John had made improper sexual advances to the assistant coach. The lawsuit was settled out of court. Mark Schultz left his job and home at Foxcatcher, unable to cope with John's strange behaviour and constant interference into his life, training and coaching. Now in his 50s, John decided to become a professional wrestler, having previously only competed during his high school years. He competed in the 1992 Veterans World Championships in Cali, Colombia, then in 1993 in Toronto, Canada, and Sofia, Bulgaria in 1995. John's behaviour became ever more strange. He started claiming that he could hear things in the woods and believed that intruders were entering his house through tunnels. He believed aliens were spying on him, called in psychics to remove evil spirits, and was convinced that a device existed in his mansion which sprayed oil which could make people disappear. From his pentathlon training, John was an expert marksman and had amassed an arsenal of guns and ammunition. He was frequently armed when out and about on the estate. At one point, he removed all of the treadmills from the training gyms as he believed that they were taking him back in time. During this time, he was rumoured to be consuming large amounts of alcohol mixed with cocaine, which would have only served to amplify his problems and behaviours. In 1995, he pulled a machine gun on wrestler Dan Chade and banned him from the training facility. Even though this was reported to the police, there was no follow-up and the incident was written off as John being John. Slowly, John's interest in wrestling began to wane. Many of the wrestlers had left due to his erratic behaviour, and John had banned many others from the facility. Dave and his wife Nancy tried to get John to seek help for his addictions, but John always refused, saying that if he admitted to being an addict, other members of his family would try to take his money and the estate from him. At this time, another wrestler, Valentin Jordanov, was also living at Foxcatcher, and John became increasingly obsessed with him. John became jealous of Dave and Valentin's easygoing friendship, having always struggled to make any true connections himself. Struggling to deal with John's behaviour, Dave and Nancy began talking about leaving Foxcatcher and were considering taking up an opportunity for Dave to coach at Stanford whilst he was training for a comeback at the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta. On the 26th of January 1996, Valentin's birthday, John drove with his head of security, former US Marine Patrick Goodale, to Dave's house on the estate. As John stepped out of his silver Lincoln town car, Dave said, "Hi coach," to which John replied by drawing a revolver and firing 3 bullets directly at Dave. Dave was hit in the elbow, chest and back. Hearing the gunfire, Nancy rushed outside and witnessed her husband being shot for the 3rd time. Dave was transferred to Mercy Haverford Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. He left behind his wife of 15 years and 2 children aged 9 and 6. After the shooting, John returned to the main house, where he locked himself inside. Aware of the number of weapons and explosives in the house, the police were not prepared to rush in and a standoff followed. The police negotiated with John via the telephone from a command centre in the nearby fire station. The wrestling centre was used as a base for the 75 officers involved. It was reported that during this time, John claimed to be the Dalai Lama, the President of Bulgaria, and the Holy Child. The police decided to turn the power off to the house, and on the 29th of January 1996, 3 days after the shooting, John announced to the police that he was coming out to fix the boiler. He left the house unarmed and seemed stunned that he was being arrested, again claiming to be the Dalai Lama. It was initially ruled that he was incompetent to stand trial and could not participate in his own defence. He was sent to the Norristown State Hospital, awaiting further evaluation. The case eventually went to trial nearly a year later on the 21st of January 1997, with John pleading not guilty by reason of insanity. However, the insanity defence was thrown out by the court. His defence team called an expert witness who described John as having schizophrenia and paranoia, and that John believed that Dave was part of an international conspiracy to kill him. The defence also tried to blame John's head of security, Patrick Goodale, accusing him of feeding John's paranoia and turning John into a killer. The prosecution argued that John had asked to speak to his lawyer several times during the police standoff, indicating that he understood what was going on. On the 25th of February 1997, a jury returned a verdict of guilty of third-degree murder but mentally ill. Third-degree murder indicates a lack of intent to kill, and Guilty but mentally ill means that he was found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and that at the time the crime was committed, he was mentally ill but not legally insane. Due to the nature of this verdict, John's sentencing was referred to the judge, who could rule a sentence of anywhere between 5 and 40 years. On the 13th of May 1997, John was sentenced to 13 to 30 years in prison and was sent to the State Correctional Institution, Mercer, a minimum security prison. A motive for the killing has never been established, although various theories such as jealousy, disagreements about money, or fear of Dave leaving the estate have all been suggested. After his arrest, John ordered all of the buildings at Foxcatcher Farm to be painted matte black, reportedly believing that this would make them disappear. After the verdict, Nancy, Dave's widow, filed a wrongful death suit against John, which was settled out of court in November 1999. The amount of this has never been disclosed, but it was reported by the press at the time that anonymous sources put the figure at around $35 million. It was also said that these were put in trust for their children. Nancy later started a foundation and wrestling club in her husband's name. John's defence team appealed his conviction and, in 2000, his case reached the US Supreme Court. The verdict was upheld. On the 29th of January 2009, John was denied parole. Just under 2 years later, on the 9th of December 2010, 72-year-old John was found unresponsive in his bed at the correctional institution. He was pronounced dead at 6:55 a.m, having died from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. As stated in his will, John was buried in his red Foxcatcher wrestling singlet at the DuPont de Nemours Cemetery in Wilmington, Delaware. In his will, which was unsuccessfully contested by his niece and nephew, he left 80% of his fortune to the family of Valentin Jordanov, with the remaining 20% going to the Eurasian Pacific Wildlife Foundation in Pennsylvania. 3 years later, in 2013, the 90-year-old DuPont mansion was demolished, and the land has now been developed as a community of luxury homes. Thanks for listening to that case today. Please add any comments down below. If you found today's case interesting, please click like, and if you're new to the channel, please subscribe. I usually release videos on a weekly basis. Thanks very much for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. The 2014 film Foxcatcher was based on the relationship between John and the Schultz brothers. Steve Carell, who played John, was nominated for Best Actor at the Academy Awards. Goodbye.